Okay. This is filming. Audio is recording. Hello? Hopefully the microphone does not disconnect again. Okay. Doo-doo. Ooh, that's not good. Basically, I just need you to understand, no matter who you are, this is a set of things that you should know because there are laws that protect disability and resources provided specifically for people classified as disabled. And you hang out, you see these people protected by the law because of their disability every single day. And most of them don't know what that means. And you probably don't know what that means. Another just set of data. If you are born with a disability and you happen to be poor, that disability is more likely to become worse. And then you are less likely to be able to work. And you are less likely to be able to make a living income. If you develop a disability during your lifetime, which many people do, that same cycle applies. When you have really good access to healthcare, you are less likely to develop a disability. And just however that is, it turns out that people born below the poverty line are more likely to be born with a disability or develop a disability during their life. Food for thought. Whatever the solution for that is, I don't know, but there sure ought to be one. In any case, I forget what I was saying. I mean, the other side of that is also, if you do develop a disability, you are more likely to be socioeconomically mobile in a downwards direction. Because it's just harder to work when you have a disability. That's like how disability is defined. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I will edit in the year that passed, or not. The American with Disabilities Act provides protection and accommodations to people with a recognized disability. The way the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA from now on, the way the ADA defines disability is A person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such impairment. That's federal law. Across the United States, that's how a disability is defined. I live in California, so I'm going to throw in California special information. A disability is defined in the state of California as conditions that limit a major life activity, including physical and mental disabilities, as well as medical conditions such as cancer or HIV/AIDS. California definitions and protections can be broader than protections under federal law. Because I live in California, my conception of a disability is slightly broader than the full-on United States. But that's okay. I say that just because I want you to know that I say that because I want you to know that throughout this video, assume that I mean the California definition of a disability because I work and live in California, and that's the version that I have to abide by in my day-to-day life. So that's the version that's like stuck the most in my head, which is a little bit broader than federally across the United States. And if you don't live in the United States, first of all, why are you watching this? And second of all, not gonna lie, I do not know the definition of disability where you live. Sorry. But both of those definitions involved the phrase major life activity. They both start with a sentence that includes the phrase limits one or more major life activities. Both of them include that phrase, to limit one or more major life activities. So, what is a major life activity? A major life activity is just an activity that the average person could do with little to no difficulty. It's just literally anything that is something you do every day. That could include walking, reading, communicating, talking, like being able to see or hear, being able to quickly process what another person says when they speak and then respond. That's a lot on communicating. But the use of any of the five senses, going to work, reading, learning new skills, or did I already say working? Making money? Even regulating emotions, like anything that makes those daily tasks more difficult is defined in the state of California and a bit more tightly defined across the United States as a disability. I would drop the microphone, but it cost money. Sorry about that. So, I feel like for most people, the definition of a disability, like the literal legal definition, is a lot broader than the people they imagine when they think of a disability, like a disabled person or a person with a disability. Both of those phrases can be acceptable. I'll get to that later. But already, I feel like most people living their day-to-day lives, when they imagine what is a disability, they think of a much narrower set of things, like the inability to walk, somebody who might need to use a wheelchair, the inability to see, the inability to hear, or major cognitive impairments that are outwardly obvious to most passersby. But that's not what a disability is. A disability is any kind of condition that limits a major life activity. Legally. But just knowing what the term disability means, I'm so sorry, sweetie, is like literally the bare minimum to provide the proper respect. In my personal opinion, that's my opinion. But I do think that everybody, like, no matter who you are, if you live in the United States, you should know that first part. Like, you should know that, because we all work here, we all represent companies here, and companies can get sued if you don't know what a disability is and what the protections are for a disability. So I think everybody should know that. But also, I lost the microphone because I gave up on it. So let's pretend that I never had a microphone. And I'm sure the audio from my iPhone will be just fine for baby's first video. We can figure the rest out later. In any case, I'm a little ranty all the time. That is like a really wide array of conditions that's likely wider than you imagined it to be. Like when you're walking around imagining a disability, you probably only imagine a really small category or set of categories amongst something that is actually much broader than we realize. Again, legally. So I think a really good framework for being able to better imagine the range of disabilities is to break it up into different categories. This is a set of categories. No. This is a set of categories that I kind of stole from my employer. I work at the Disneyland Resort. But I think that, like, unironically, I really think that the way the disability advocacy organizations within Disney have found a way to break down categories is actually really, really useful, because the way that they break it down is Number one, it does its best to find a way to at least loosely describe almost every disability that you might run into on a daily basis. And they have to do that because they're a company and they are, trying to respect that disability is a protected class of people, really protecting themselves by taking care of this group of people. But there is a group of advocates. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, actually. Okay, I'm so sorry. I almost got really into where the where all these ideas about disability come from within the Walt Disney Company, specifically at the Disneyland Resort. And I don't know exactly what I'm allowed to say, so I'm gonna describe it a lot more broadly than I started describing it before. I'm so sorry. I probably would have been fine, but I'm just a paranoid person. And I'm protecting myself. But I think I'd be allowed to say this. There's these business employee resource groups for different sets of identities, and one of those groups is for and by people with disabilities. And I think that having that group has really helped the company get a better idea of how to accommodate more people with simpler solutions. And that, I think, is why they have such a good way of breaking it down, if that makes sense. Because I know that, like, the voices of people with disabilities are being heard in the process of creating these really ways to accommodate. And this is literally, like, I think it's available, like, on public websites, and if it's not, then I'm gonna really have to find a way to edit this in a way that doesn't make me fear for my job. In any case, I stole these categories from Disneyland. So the categories are in this system: cognitive disabilities, hearing disabilities, mobility disabilities, visual disabilities, and service animals. So instead of trying to find a way to make everybody's diagnosis fit into all these boxes, they make it much broader and really consider it from the angle of what types of accommodations that person might need. How can you be able to categorize somebody's disability in your mind quickly and efficiently, but also kindly and respectfully? And I really think that that's what they've done with these groups and categories, is just found a way to kind of have these really big boxes that almost anybody can fit into. Anybody with a disability can fit into. So one more time, that's cognitive disabilities, visual disabilities, mobility disabilities, hearing disabilities. I have no idea where I started. Okay. Cognitive, hearing, okay, so one more time, that's cognitive disabilities, hearing disabilities, mobility disabilities, visual disabilities, and service animals. And these categories are just, again, so helpful. I'm probably gonna have to edit out the amount of times I said how much I love these categories because it's getting embarrassing. But here's just kind of an overview of each of those categories. If you have a visual impairment, I was just showing, oh my gosh, that's embarrassing. If you have a visual impairment, I was just showing, once again, the, wow. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna explain why I'm doing that instead of just doing it. Okay, I also am like really into education, and I, if you're watching this, I really want you to remember what I've said, or at least remember as much as possible. So I'm going to use a lot of like vocabulary, and vocabulary repetition, so that hopefully my goal is that you leave this video knowing what a disability is and having these categories in your mind to be able to kind of parse out those, like the breadth of what disabilities can be. So I'm going to say this a lot. Visual, hearing, mobility. I did it out of order, and that bothered me because I have a disability. Cognitive, hearing, mobility, visual, or service animal. And if you have a vision impairment, I've also kind of created hand motions to go with each of those, you know, pointing to my head for cognitive, ear for hearing, eye for visual. So if you like to use your body to remember things, this is going to be so corny, but I'm in music and we use hand symbols for so much when we're learning. I actually think that if you want to remember, it might help you to do these along with me, to have hand symbols that'll help you remember. It's like very kindergarten of me, but I'm just saying. In any case, that first category, cognitive, includes, let me check my slides, includes all disabilities with, it includes all disabilities with some kind of impact on cognitive function. So when you think about that, well, what kind of disabilities would impact cognitive function? That may be an intellectual disability. It may be autism, it may be ADHD, it may be any kind of mental illness, it may be a stroke, it may be Alzheimer's disease, it may be dementia. There are so many kinds of cognitive disabilities, but that's a category to keep in mind, you know? Because a lot of times, those are disabilities that we don't notice unless they are really quote unquote severe, unless somebody's behavior due to that disability is just really outwardly obvious to the average passerby. We usually don't think of those, but a lot of those cognitive disabilities are ones that people can kind of learn to hide when they're out in public or when they're talking to somebody, and then like kind of deal with them on their own, like in my room, oh my gosh, I talked to so many people today. Oh, that's my dramatic reenactment of masking. Sorry, but once again, a lot of these types of disabilities are something that on the inside make these daily tasks of sometimes just making decisions, sometimes literally getting out of bed. Sometimes every activity you do causes some kind of mental pain, or there are some really frequent activities that cause mental pain and it's like not in your control. I have a cognitive disability, and I would ask you to think of it as something like chronic arthritis, but for the brain. Like, there are some mental tasks that actually hurt to do. And I don't know a better way to describe that. But once sorry, this is like getting into deeper than I mean to in this video, but truly once I kind of understood, and not just understood, but like internally accepted that some things that I have to do just like literally hurt. And I mean, someone with arthritis might hurt with every step that they take, but they've decided that it's worth walking. So like, they may benefit from a mobility device, but they might have a disability that you just don't see because they're used to the pain. So they don't need to show you that pain, because then it'll just make it a whole thing, and then you'll worry about them, and then you'll be like, oh, are you sure you don't want to sit down? Or even worse, you'll be like, get over it. My knees hurt sometimes, so you'll be fine. Like, if you can hide your disability, it makes your life so much easier, because then you don't have to explain it to everybody. So, sorry. That's why I wanted to start with cognitive disabilities, because once again, we often imagine a really smaller portion of what the breadth of cognitive disabilities might be. We imagine the ones that hurt so much that it's obvious to you on the outside that it hurts. But there are lots of both physical and cognitive conditions that people just decide it's easier if I figure it out on my own, because I don't want to have to explain my medical history to everyone that I meet, you know? Like, that's a thing. But the kinds of accommodations that people with cognitive disabilities might need would be learning supports, quiet spaces, especially if somebody is like their brain kind of processes their senses all really loudly. That could be called a sensory processing disorder. Like, or in reverse, if your brain processes like really quietly, so that maybe you don't notice that you're in pain until you've already caused a more severe injury than you should have. That's like the reverse side of, sorry. But if you are overly sensitive to stimuli, which also, interestingly, is a possible symptom of like being in which also, funnily enough, is a possible symptom of chronic like dysregulation, which is basically like your brain kind of defaulting to fight or flight. That's what dysregulation in a nutshell means. If you ever hear that word around, dysregulation, think fight or flight. My mother is a psychologist, and if I described that poorly, I'm going to be very embarrassed. But let me just get through the list that I thought of before of what kind of accommodations a cognitive disability might need to help that person get by with less pain, because otherwise I will ramble way too long. So it may include learning supports, quiet spaces, extended deadlines, communication guidance, like really going out of your way to teach someone how to have a conversation, or enrollment in special education, especially if that student or that person is a student in public school. They may qualify for special education, which exists as a way to help disabled people not be constantly either excluded or in pain. And in fact, any category of disability may qualify for special education, because the purpose of special education is for people who not just don't naturally learn the way that our schools run, which, like, a fair amount of people, even if they don't naturally learn that way, like, they can figure out how to do it without bothering anyone else. And pretty much, if you're one of those people who can just figure it out, even if it's difficult for you, if you can figure it out on your own without being in, like, severe physical or mental pain all the time, you're probably going to do that, because that's just going to make your life go smoother. But otherwise, if somebody is just so incompatible with the way public schools run, then they might be helped by special education, because at least they'll be not in that painful environment where you're either in pain or excluded all the time, you know? That's the purpose of special education, by the way. But again, those are kind of the things that you should know when you think, oh, what's a cognitive disability? You should be thinking any kind of disability that impacts the brain and the kind of accommodations people might need for that. Like anything that involves a lot of thinking might need some help with somehow. Sounds really basic, but if you want to know more, you'd have to do a lot of research, which you can if you want, but I don't want to do that much research, you know? So, next category. Hearing. It doesn't matter. Hearing disabilities include a wide spectrum of hearing abilities. It's anyone whose ability to hear, or lack thereof, impacts one or more major life activity. That's what it is. I mean, it's very straightforward. If you cannot hear well enough or clearly enough to get through the day without running into a bunch of problems, then you have a hearing disability. This category is a bit narrower than cognitive disabilities, because the brain, just a second. The brain has a hand in like every part of the body. So when you think of cognitive disabilities, it's like huge. A huge amount of disabilities. A huge array of types of disabilities, because everything you do depends on the brain. Everything you do does not depend on the ears. And that sounds so terrible of me. Like, having a hearing disability is often in many cases, causes you to run into more problems than a cognitive disability. It just depends on where you fall in that category of hearing disability or where you fall in that category of cognitive disability. And you could have both at the same time. But hearing disabilities, the types of accommodations that they might need would be the use of sign language, communication via text instead of out loud, because learning how to read lips can be really hard. Having subtitles, which I'm making sure in this video that I have subtitles and I'm going through and making sure that all the words are right, so it's not just that auto feature. But auto features are also really useful because not everybody has the time or ability to create their own subtitles. So props to all the apps that do have those auto features, especially if the auto features actually work well. But in general, just having visual representations of what's being said as much as possible. And that's one where having visual representations of what's being said, like, it might be super necessary if you have a hearing impairment or a hearing related disability. You might just straight up need those visual representations. But if you have a cognitive disability, that makes it hard for you to maybe process information quickly. You might benefit from having both at the same time. So all of your senses are feeding you the same information. And even if you don't have a disability, it still can help you if you're in a noisy room and you want subtitles. So, because you won't be able to hear the movie well enough, but you still want to make sure you know what they're saying. Like, having visual representations of what is being spoken or what is being heard by most people can be helpful to anyone. But it's also very necessary for some people, but it can be helpful to anyone. But moving on to mobility disabilities, and there's a common theme when I start talking about all of the accommodations, because as it turns out, not only can anyone develop a disability at any point in their life, also things that help disabled people or people with disabilities, again, either one is acceptable. Also, usually the things that help disabled people also just help everybody in general, usually. And there's, it's a break in the middle of the video to talk about something else. That's actually what's called the curb cut effect, is when something is changed about how we work as a society, like just the daily expectations everybody has. Something is changed in order to support people with disabilities. Something is changed so that those people can do those daily tasks that are limited for them, any major life activity, like the cutting of curbs at street corners, so that somebody who uses a wheelchair or a walker or any kind of mobility device, or even like a blind cane, a white cane, so that people with those disabilities can safely get off the sidewalk and back up onto the sidewalk on the other side of the street. But now, if you are walking with a stroller or a wagon or anything on wheels, you're gonna be so pissed if there's no curb cuts. You're gonna be annoyed. But the difference is, you're gonna be annoyed in those individual instances, and somebody who relies on a mobility device is going to be prevented from doing whatever normal thing you were doing when you got annoyed, and everything else you walk on the sidewalk for. Anyways. A mobility disability refers to anybody whose ability to move or inability to move impacts their ability to perform daily life tasks. And I would like to add daily life tasks without also being in pain. Many people with mobility disabilities use mobility devices such as canes, wheelchairs, walkers, or braces, or they might just be a little savvy about it and move as little as possible to avoid being in pain. Or they may have some other discreet way of hiding their disability because they don't feel like explaining it to you. And the reason that annoys me so much is because, I don't know, if you don't have a disability, just imagine you ran into those problems like all day, every day, but also it's such a pain in the butt to explain why it's a problem. So instead, you just try to go through it as quickly and easily as possible without anybody noticing that you're in pain. Because that's just how much you experience it. Anyways, accommodations that people with mobility disabilities might use. Also, real quick, sorry. This category, especially in the state of California, includes a lot of chronic illnesses and a lot of chronic conditions outside of something like a permanent injury or a limb difference or things along those lines. Like if a person has cancer and they're too exhausted from treatment and from their condition in the first place to be able to walk, that would count as a mobility disability. Same for, any kind of chronic condition or long-term illness that can create circumstances like that and really exhaust a person's physical body because it's just constantly having to deal with that chronic condition. That's what chronic means. Accommodations include mobility devices, medication in some cases, ramps, wider walkways or passages to make sure it's wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair, seated tables, not just having standing cocktail tables at an event, for instance, and making sure that there's just in general space for wheelchairs and other types of mobility devices, because Nothing says, like, I don't care about you, like pulling up somewhere and realizing there's no way for you to get in or no way for you to get to the bathroom. Like, that's a really big F you. You know? Same thing as, instead of if there's no way to do those things, if it causes you so much pain to do those things. Neither one is ideal. The next category is visual disabilities. This includes a wide spectrum of visual abilities, much like hearing disabilities. It may be, once again, a really wide variety of sightedness or impaired sightedness or blindness. And also, just so you know, being blind or legally blind, they both mean the same thing, is not just like blackout vision. Some blind people do have some sight, but they are still blind. Let us broaden our minds together. Okay, thank you. This is legal information. So, anyone whose ability to see or lack thereof prevents them from participating in major life activities as previously defined has a visual disability. If glasses weren't so easy to get, and by the way, they still cost hundreds of dollars, but if glasses weren't so easy to get, I might have a visual disability. They're just pretty standard, so I'm not walking around telling everybody. Types of accommodations include the use of Braille, having like tactile signals on everyday tools like those bumps on a keyboard. Screen readers, it's something that can kind of scan your screen, pick out all the text and read it to you. They work sometimes. Enlarged text, having audio or having auditory representations of whatever's being shown. And that's another thing, much like I was saying with hearing disabilities, like, yeah, it is a necessity for some people, but like, it helps to have your senses matched up in terms of like really engaging with an experience and like creating a memory about that experience. Like, if it's something worth remembering, it's probably good to have both a visual and an auditory version. And at the same time, this is for everybody. It's even better to have some kind of tactile or, you know, kinetic, that's the word. Kinesthetic, that's the word. It's helpful for anyone with any kind of disability, without a disability, to pair not just the visual, but also the audio and some kind of kinesthetic movement. That's just helpful for anyone, but it's especially helpful for people with disabilities. Any kind of disability, really. Because any kind of disability is gonna be taking up some of your brain space all the time. Even if it's not a cognitive disability, it's gonna be something you have to worry about all the time and figure out how you're going to get around all these situations. So it helps to have all the things. Anywho, the last category is not a type of disability or a category of disability. It is really a category of accommodation that is common across all types of disability. And that is service animals. People with any kind of disability or disease may require a service animal. When people say service animals are doing a job, they mean it. Like, if you have a service animal, not only do they have this standard level of animal training, well above pet training, they also have, on top of this, one specialty that they're trained for. No matter what kind of animal it is, it can't just have this basic training. This is from my understanding of a service animal. Can't just have this basic level of training that any pet could have. It also has some kind of specialty training to benefit the disabled person. If you have a disease or chronic condition, a service animal may be able to smell cancerous cells, may be able to smell if you have diabetes, may be able to smell your blood sugar level. Like, there are a surprising amount of service animals that, like, their whole thing is to smell for some kind of disease flare-up. Another kind that people with cognitive disabilities often have is dogs that are trained to recognize signs of dysregulation, think fight or flight, in their person, and at the same time may be trained to catch specific behaviors, like a picking behavior, and provide like a really like scientifically useful form of comfort for people in dysregulation, and may provide the ability to, block your hands from doing something that might be harmful. Sorry. And I do want to add, because emotional support animals are a different category from service animals. Emotional support animals might be really helpful to some people, but they're simply not gate-kept in the same way that service animals are, if that makes sense. And because like service animals are so gate-kept, you have to let them anywhere. If they are a service animal, You have to. If you're an Uber driver, you have to let that animal in your vehicle. If you're a store, you have to let that animal in your store. If you're a vacation spot, a resort location, you have to allow a service animal just about anywhere. Like, a service animal is like a medical device. So, that's why it's important to, I think, have that additional category of service animal. And once again, that's why I think those categories that they've created at the Disneyland Resort work so well, because they kind of force you, if you can remember those categories, it puts you in a good place to remember any kind of person legally defined as disabled that you are likely to come across. It might be missing some people, and if it's missing you, I'm really sorry. But it's the best, in my opinion, like, set of categories that I've ever seen. It's my favorite way to try to help educate about disability. So thanks, Mickey. But when it comes to service animals, just to finish what I actually wrote, it's important to remember that even if you love animals, do not touch the animal. Do not pet the animal. Don't even look at the animal. And I'm so serious about that because it can break their concentration. And I mean, like, would you touch a medical device? Think this way about mobility devices too, like a wheelchair. Think any like extra paraphernalia that a disabled person carries with them all the time or has with them all the time. Just think of it like it's an oxygen tank. Think, if that were an oxygen tank, would I touch it? If that were an oxygen tank, would I move it right now? Like, you have to look at it like that, or else you might be accidentally being a jerk to the person who it belongs to, because it might be that important to them. And there's no way of knowing unless you know everything about that person's medical history, which would be really inconvenient for them. So my rule of thumb is, once again, any paraphernalia, extra stuff that a disabled person has with them, anything. Pretend it's an oxygen tank. Treat it like it's an oxygen tank. Because I don't know how important it is to you. And I don't know if me moving it is going to be like a little annoying or if it's going to be like life-threatening. So, food for thought. However, this is still about service animals. I swear to God. Basically, service animals are an oxygen tank. And that's how important they are. Do not interact with, do not touch, do not pet a service animal without explicit permission. That's the other part, is they are still a living being, so sometimes it's still okay for them to be social, because they are a living being and they need that. But it's important for you to just look to that disabled person to figure out whether right now this is a dog or right now this is an oxygen tank. Like, you gotta check with the disabled person, the person with a disability, before even looking at the dog. or whatever the service animal is. And because service animals are so gatekept, because companies are required to allow service animals in, the only way to verify that an animal is a service animal that you as a company are allowed to do, or if you're representing a company, is ask, what service does this animal provide? Because if it's a service animal, they will know off the top of their head what service that animal provides. Because they have to know to get it certified as a service animal. They simply have to know what it does. You can't just know this basic level of training. There has to be a specialty. That's why it's the only question you're allowed to ask, is because that is something that anybody who uses a service animal will know. A question they can answer easily. So, not sponsored. Girl. Oh, yeah. And remember, now that we've gone through all those 5 categories, say it with me, class. Cognitive, hearing, mobility, visual, or service animal. Any one disabled person may fall into any number from 1 to 5, in some rare cases 0, of those categories. So, if you want to know what is a disability above that legal definition, the legal definition being, say it with me, any condition that limits a major life activity. If you want to know beyond that level, you can think of these 5 categories. And you will remember more types of disabled people more quickly if you remember just those 5 categories. So, what is a disability indeed? When I repeat the question, it makes me feel like philosophy tube. I'm Abigail. I'm not Abigail. I never introduced myself. My name is Joy. So, anyway, the first step to solving a problem is accepting the problem. We can all agree on that? Probably. I really hope. Like, we say that about everything, right? You can't work on fixing something unless you know it's broken. And what I am not saying right now, this is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that having a disability makes you broken. That would be an awfully mean thing to say. No. People having disabilities is an indication that something is messed up. Because it really sucks that we have a whole category of people who, like, the only definition is that they struggle every day. Like, that's the definition of a disability, me rewording it the way I think of it, the way I understand it, based on what I've learned. Having a disability means you struggle every day. And we have a legally protected class for people who struggle every day. That's like crazy. That's sad. That's like sad. We have a legally protected class for people that are either unable to or who doing these things causes them so much pain that it limits their ability to, like, do normal everyday stuff. Talk to people. Walk. See. That's sad. Like, we've known that people were struggling for a long time, actually. And if there's so many of them that we have to make a box to put them in legally, there's probably more we could do to make less people suffer so much. Like, I can get glasses super easy, and once I have glasses, boom, my vision, perfect. Don't have to deal with it. That's just because a lot of people have low-level vision impairments. So enough people had the problem that somebody figured out how to deal with it. We got lucky, you know? So, like, I feel like probably more of these things that currently fall under the definition of disability, like, there's a fair amount of them that their solution is something that is possible, and it might not even be that difficult. You know? Like, we might already know how to fix it, and we're just not figuring out how to make it cheaper, or we're not figuring out how to make insurance cover it, or something like that. Like, even just visually, even in terms of visual disabilities, there are some types of blindness that, like, could be solved with the surgery, but people just can't afford it, and that sucks. That's, like, really significant to not be able to afford. That's, like, scary. But at the same time, there are people who just can't see and who never will be able to see. So, like, you know, just keeping in this one category of visual disabilities, like, we all know what's up with eyes. And we all know that blind people exist. But we make all of our presentations so dependent on the visuals in a lot of cases. And if there's ever a silent moment in a film, like one of those really intense moments where even the music stops and all that matters is what's happening on screen, sucks to suck, I guess. And I mean, that kind of moment is not like that dramatic. Like, you're not missing out on that much in life, but you're still missing out on something. And at the same time, like, everybody's gonna miss out on something in their life. Like, that's normal. But, like, first of all, they're probably missing out on more than you if you don't have a visual disability. Or if you're not blind. And nothing's being done about it. Or very little, very slowly is being done about it. When there's, like, actually quite a few people, and people are, like, homeless because of this. Like, not to be all super dramatic, but, like, tell me, please, tell me with 100% confidence, like, if you can, I would be so happy that you are so 100% confident that no person has ever become unhoused as a result of blindness. Think about that. Like, that sucks. That just sucks. Do you believe that no person, even in the last 50 years, let's think about probably, like, anybody who's watching this is probably 50 years or younger. So, like, during your lifetime or really, really recently before that, do you think that people have become unhoused because they couldn't work because they were blind? Do you think a lot of people end up in a situation like that? Or even just not making as much money just because they're blind? I mean, let me check when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, because that will impact the answer, you know. Was the Americans with Disabilities Act 50 or less years ago? I'm not sure off the top of my head. When do you think the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed? The ADA National Network website? The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990. I'm showing the website on the screen right now, by the way. Or I was. I'm not showing it anymore. Go back. 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020. That's 34 years ago. And it was actually 33 and a half years ago. So, like, that makes me really, really confident that there's actually probably a lot of people who were unhoused before the 90s and even into the 90s, because it's like kind of creating a preventative thing to try to keep that from happening as much. But it's not like going back and finding all the unhoused or incredibly poor people who are incredibly poor because they couldn't work, because they couldn't see because they were blind. Some of those people are probably still alive. Hopefully most of them have houses now, but like, that's a lot of people that I'm imagining right now, like for me, with that set of information, and that freaks me out. Sorry, when I started filming this, I knew in my head, like, it was more recent than I thought that this law passed. But it's more recent than I thought like 1990, in July of 1990. That's the first time disability even like became something with a specific definition, was 1990. That's the first time that we created that category. But all those people existed before then. That's terrible. And lots of those people are not even that old. They remember what it was like before then. If you were disabled in the United States before July of 1990, I'm sorry, that sucks. Wow, I'm sorry. I didn't even fully like put that all together in my head until right now. Once again, the reason I got there is because I said the first step to solving a problem is like accepting that there's a problem. And I was trying to convince you that there's like definitely some kind of problem that needs to be fixed. And in doing so, I just convinced myself even more. But hopefully, if I did enough to convince myself even more than I already did, and I already believed it enough to make this video, then hopefully I convinced a fair amount of people. And if not, then this is going to be really embarrassing. But the bottom line is it doesn't help anybody when you ignore their disability, which is something that I kind of have been trying to plant as a seed throughout every like section of this, is that like, first things first, like disability is a real defined specific thing, like legally. So it doesn't really matter how you feel about it. Like, if you disagree with the definition of disability, then I don't know what to tell you. Like, you might get sued, but hopefully you're not in some kind of position where you'll get yourself sued for happening to not understand what a disability is. But in any case, I also have some tools to try to help give people the language to talk about it. Because accepting it is one thing, being able to talk about it is another. And I feel that I have learned enough to create just kind of a set of guidelines to help people navigate the language that they use specifically and accurately and respectfully. And I think all three of those, being specific, not overgeneralizing, being accurate, not maybe assuming something that you don't know, and being respectful, like literally, you know, respecting each other as human beings. Like, those three things are my guiding forces in deciding which things are most important, if that makes sense. But in any case, the first, number one guideline that I will give you is if you forget everything else. If you forget every other guideline, you can pretty solidly default to using something called person-first language. In a professional setting, this is generally what's most expected and accepted. It's kind of what the people in the know who work professionally will usually default to, if that makes sense. And that requires you to first, whenever you refer to that person, make sure you refer to them as a person before you mention the disability. Use their name before you mention the disability. Literally say a person with a disability. That's kind of the overarching, if you naturally default to that, your bases are decently covered. Not perfectly, but decently. It's just a good default, is what I have to say about that. The goal of person-first language is to center a person's humanity. So the idea is if somebody uses a mobility device, like a wheelchair, you make sure to acknowledge them before you acknowledge their mobility device, because they are the person. That's pretty straightforward. So examples of this could be a person with a disability, a person with Crohn's disease, a person with limb differences. That's kind of the term for limb differences. Anything beyond 2 hands, 10 fingers, 2 hands, 5 fingers on each hand, 2 feet, 5 fingers on each feet, etc. Anything other than that is generally referred to as limb differences. But person with limb differences, person using a mobility device. If somebody is using a mobility device, which is anything from a wheelchair to a walker to a cane to even a brace, anything something uses to help them get around is a mobility device. And if you don't know that person, then all you know about them is what you see, and what you see is the mobility device. So, overarching term, person using a mobility device, person using a wheelchair, person using a cane. And lastly, a person with autism. But, and actually this is particularly prevalent in my experience among the autistic community, a lot of people with disabilities don't really vibe with that professional language of what's considered to be the most respectful in a business sense. I don't know, like the default, or as it were, because a lot of people with disabilities feel like it's great and all that you're recognizing that I'm a person, but having to use a wheelchair impacts every part of my life. I want to make sure that you understand I am disabled. I don't have a disability. It's not something I carry around with me. It is a part of me. And that's where the phrase disabled people or disabled community comes in respectfully. A lot of people prefer that identity-first language, where their condition is named before the person. So in that instance, it would be like a blind person, an autistic person, phrases like that. Probably not. Maybe wheelchair using person. That's one that I don't I don't think people really say that. But still, like, disabled person is probably what you would say in that case. But all that is to say, some people feel disempowered when you use person first language because they feel like this thing that is a part of their everyday life is like just being pushed to the side. That's kind of the vibe there. So either one, in my opinion, is perfectly fine. But if you are in specific circles, especially specific professional circles, you might catch some kind of flack for using identity first language when really it tends to be a preference among the disability community in my like anecdotal experience. So in any case, once you know what a person prefers, you can pretty much just use that. When I gave this presentation in my club, one of the questions that I got was about this. So I'm going to kind of hopefully jump ahead of that, which is that somebody, like one of my friends, has a family member who like makes really crude jokes about their disability and might even ask my friend to call them by words that sometimes could be counted as a slur against disabled people. Like, in that case, if somebody is asking you to say something that you feel is disrespectful or may in some cases be considered a slur among some communities, there's one that starts with a C, there's one that starts with an R. I am not going to say these words, but if you're unaware, those words can be considered slurs. Not by everybody, but some people are that hurt by it. In any case, also, in general, when I say some people, what I mean is probably a majority of disabled people. Like, there are certainly disabled people who don't mind people using those words. And even in this case, he likes to deal with his disability by making jokes about it. And he likes to use that word. And he might jokingly ask, or even seriously ask, a family member to use that word in reference to him. But in those cases, I would create a boundary for myself. I'm not willing to say words that I feel are disrespectful. And that's something you're allowed to do. So that's how I would navigate something like that. In general, person first language is always okay. It's never bad. It's just sometimes a little annoying. At this point in time, this might become outdated. If somebody prefers, like, the other way around, if they prefer to be called a disabled person instead of a person with a disability, that's pretty chillin'. That's almost never disrespectful. And if somebody has that preference, they have that preference for a reason. Anything outside of those, you can take on a case-by-case basis. You can take on a case-by-case basis. If you're ever not comfortable with something, the appropriate answer is, I don't feel like I know enough about this to say that. That's a cool and okay thing to say. I don't feel like I know enough about disability, what's respectful, to say that. That's just making someone aware of why you're making the choice that you're making. Is that you're not comfortable with it. Because you don't know enough. And you are not disabled. So, this is another thing that I've also mentioned quite a bit, which is that some disabilities are invisible. That's like a big thing to remember when you think about communicating about disabilities. And that is just to say, never assume that when you see somebody, you can tell whether or not they are disabled. You cannot ever tell by looking at somebody, especially very briefly, whether or not they have a disability. There are many disabilities that can be effectively hidden or masked because it's just easier that way. Like, it's just easier if you don't have to explain yourself all the time. And it's just important to remember those people. Because I just think it's not very nice to know that they exist and to not try to do something. Like, that feels like a solvable thing. Like, people suffering quietly, that feels like a more immediately solvable thing to me. So I feel like just general awareness, invisible disabilities exist. You can't tell if someone's disabled, legally disabled. You cannot tell if someone is disabled by looking at them. Just keeping that in mind, I think, could alleviate a fair amount of suffering at this current point in time. And that's why I think it's important for people to know, if that makes sense. That's actually like why I made this video, actually. And that's where things like disability pride can really come in. Wow, what a segue. Because disability pride is maybe something that you're not aware of. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it is like a thing, it's a community. There is a disability pride flag. Like, that's a thing. My makeup is based on the disability pride flag. We got the colors of blue, yellow, white, red, and green. And the newer version of it has a zigzaggy pattern. The original version has a straight pattern. And it's like stripes on a black background diagonally. But there's reasons for all the colors and stuff, but that's not what this video is about. There's also reasons for the zigzaggy versus the straight, which is why I named all those details. But basically, the disability pride movement, as it were, is just to kind of help disabled people who have a real problem. Like, almost every disabled person is in some way, like, again, like, constantly a part of their mind is taken up, like their processing powers is taken up by their disability. Like, it's just always running in the background, reducing available space. And that's something that I think if more people understood, it'd be like faster and easier to know how to treat people respectfully, like in a way that's not going to make them feel that they have to hide so they don't have to explain themselves, you know? Like, if they felt like they didn't have to explain themselves, if you demonstrated that you have that knowledge, then they'd be more likely to feel comfortable asking for what they need, because they just have to ask for what they need without also providing an explanation. Like, the extra labor of providing an explanation is quite possibly a lot more labor than you imagine, based on, like, how much or how little people know about disability. Like, this is just one video trying to comprehensively define disability as clearly as possible. And I have no idea how long I've been sitting here talking. Just to define disability. So like, if somebody needs to ask for an accommodation because of their disability, they risk that person they're talking to not even basically understanding what a disability is. And that is why I wanted to make this video. Because that sucks. And I'd like to do something about it. I would like less people to suffer, please. And this is something I think anybody can do regardless of their overall beliefs. And even if you don't agree with it, there are also legal protections that I think you should know about if you are in a position to be sued for any reason. I don't know, man. I just think people should know. But second to last, when you talk about disability or bring it up, try to avoid like euphemisms, which can be so hard for a lot of people for a variety of reasons. Number one, there's like a lot of phrases that are currently considered the most respectful things to say. But the thing is, the people who consider it that way are not the people with the disabilities. And overwhelmingly, a lot of people with disabilities have said, like, actually, I really don't like when you use those euphemisms because it makes me feel like this thing about myself that I literally can't control is making you uncomfortable. And when I feel like just by existing, I'm making you uncomfortable, I don't want to talk to you. Because that's so awkward. That's so awkward. And like worst case scenario, that like chronic exposure to that feeling of like, ooh, just my very being makes other people uncomfortable. It's very isolating. That's not good. It's not good for that many people to feel constantly isolated for something out of their control. That's mean. I don't like that. So, try to learn what those people prefer, what makes them feel respected, instead of deciding amongst yourselves. Yourselves being the hypothetical not disabled person listening right now. Or even the hypothetical disabled person listening who is totally fine with the euphemisms. It's good to know that there's quite a few disabled people that honestly just don't like them. It's good to know, I think. I think it's a significant enough portion of disabled people who don't like them to just try to avoid using them, because if you use them, there's a good chance you're going to bother people. And you're going to cause unnecessary suffering. But there's a reason it's towards the end of the video, because this is one that, like, people, like, you only know what you know. And it takes a lot of effort to learn all of this. So, you know, if you couldn't make it this far in the video, at least you got everything before it. And if you did make it this far in the video, then I feel like you probably care enough to learn these things. That's kind of my ethos. I don't know if that's the right word. Might be pathos. I'm not Greek, actually. But examples of these like euphemisms or kind of phrases that beat around the bush are special needs is one that's used a lot. And this one is like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I hate being called special needs. I do have a disability. I didn't say that before, but I do. Rather, I am disabled. I have an array of disabilities. But, like, I don't like being called special needs, but I'm not mad at anyone for saying it. I'm just, like, annoyed a bit. And everybody's gonna feel differently. But I think enough people are annoyed that it's just good to know. It's good to know that people are annoyed by that phrase. Because it sounds like oh, she's a little special needs baby. And I am just a baby, but not like that. Good God. So, like, same with differently abled. Like, this is one, there are people with disabilities out there who are not even a little bit bothered by being called differently abled. I am simply not one of them. And I happen to know that I am not alone in this. Also, if you don't know, if you don't have specialized knowledge about a specific type of disability, and honestly, sometimes even if you do, but you don't have the knowledge about kind of the community of people who experience the disability, if that makes sense. Anything that aren't either something clearly observable, so like you can see that somebody is behaving differently than you expect, and you can be pretty confident that it's due to a disability. Oh, that's all you know about a person? This is a person who I think might have a cognitive disability, but I don't know. All I know is they're behaving differently than I expected. That is the appropriate way to talk about those people. Phrases, like, this is kind of like I don't know, like, you hear people say, like, oh, they're on the spectrum. That's not like a great thing to say. It's very generalizing, and if you're saying it, it's very unlikely that you know fully what that means. And even if you know what it means, it's also very likely that if you are not, in this case, autistic is usually what we mean, that if you are not autistic, you certainly don't know how it feels. Like, you don't know the lived experience part of it, even if you know all about it. And the thing about feelings is that we can't, like, decide them for ourselves. And they're, like, so very super difficult, pretty much impossible to have very much control over. So, like, I feel like you just have to take feelings seriously at a certain level, because you can't make them go away. You can't wish feelings away. And feelings have a significant impact on quality of life. So, like, I just think that feelings should be taken very seriously. That's just my life philosophy. But in any case, that's why I'm mentioning these things. If you care about people's feelings, these are things that you should know. If you don't care about people's feelings, you're probably not watching anymore. So that's why I'm saying all of this. I don't know why I'm so defensive. I do know why I'm so defensive. But let's pretend I don't. But phrases like high functioning, on the spectrum, everything like that, especially when you're talking about autism, just don't. If you mean autistic or autism, say that. Even if you think you mean a little bit autistic, don't say that. You don't know enough to know what you mean when you say that. And some of those phrases, like a little bit autistic, are not accurate to how the diagnosis works, if that makes sense. Like, that's just not a thing. And if you want to say something about someone else, try to make sure that you know that thing before you say it. That's kind of my rule of thumb, is that, like, if you haven't learned this, that you know that this is like a cool, normal thing to say, try not to say it. Or if you're comfortable, you can ask about it. Like, this is for if you're in the category of people who really cares about feelings. That's my advice. To avoid infantilizing or belittling language. But once again, euphemisms or qualifications like this can make some people feel like their experience is something, again, that makes you uncomfortable, that you feel like you need to tiptoe around, and that's just mentally exhausting to feel like nobody is comfortable around you, you know? So, if you don't know what to say, like, think back to the person first language. Like, that is always an acceptable default. Person with a disability. Don't know what kind of disability? Just say a disability. Don't know for sure that they have a disability? Say, I'm pretty sure they have a disability, but I mean, I don't know their medical history. You know? And if you need to provide any of those accommodations listed before, that the accommodations they need can kind of guide you to the category that their disability might fall into, or categories. Cool? But my last cute, optimistic thing to say is literally just to be honest, again. Accurate, respectful. Specific, accurate, respectful. Try to keep those as like your guiding guidelines if you're the kind of person who cares about people's feelings. And you're pretty good to go. Like, don't say something if you're not sure that you know it. And if you realize while you're saying something like, oh, I don't actually know that, like, I think that's just something I have heard about, then it's okay to say that, like, oh, sorry, I'm actually not sure if that's true. That's just the first thing I thought of, you know? Like, that's a cool and okay thing to say. But this is also important for even if you do have a disability, if you are disabled, even if you have the same diagnosis as another person. Like, again, this goes back to me talking about how, like, important I think feelings are, because, like, they're just kind of a part of our brains that we can't control. They're pretty subconsciously controlled. Like, even if you share a diagnosis, the way you process it is probably different. The way you feel about it is probably different. The things you have to do every day to, like, get around it or to accommodate yourself might be a lot the same, might be a lot different. So even if you share a diagnosis with someone, like, you can't assume that you know all these things about them. So, like, if you are an expert in it, you still can't assume that you know all these things about them specifically, because people are individuals. It's a wild concept. It's very annoying, I think, for us as human people to constantly remember if it makes sense to like genuinely treat people as individuals, because like, I mean, I don't know, our brain is just wired to want to put everything in a box, and I'm trying to create more boxes for you, but at the end of the day, people are still individuals, and you can't put every part in a box. So like, you have your boxes, and then you just assume there's probably more you don't know, but this is a fair amount for me to work with, you know? That's kind of my my life philosophy, is just to assume that I don't know everything about anybody ever. But once again, never speak or act like you know something that you don't know. That specific, accurate, and respectful. Best conversation guidelines I can give you. Not even just about disability, kind of about anything, if that's something you care about. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about or to people with disabilities, disabled people, it's just another part of who they are. Again, like, I'm trying to create these manageable boxes for us to put it in, and that's, I think, where the legal definition really comes in handy, because if you live in the United States, like, anything that limits or severely limits for United States one or more major life activities, like, that's still a pretty broad definition compared to what most people initially imagine. So I think keeping that in mind, having boxes helps us understand many more of the spectrum than the boxes that exist in our minds right now. I think, like, as a society. Hopefully that makes sense. But, like, it is just another part of who they are, and they are an individual. So it's okay to talk about disability the same way you would talk about someone's family, the same way you would talk about their pets or their religion or their ethnicity or their favorite food or their gender identity or their romantic orientation. Like, it's just another part of who they are. And it's weird if you avoid talking about it, because it makes them feel like this part of who they are is just something you would rather ignore. And that's, like, very mean. That's very mean. And I just want you to understand, not only is it okay to talk about it the same way you would talk about these other things, it is like you should. That you should be talking about it the way you talk about these other things, because it helps people know that they can be more comfortable around you, because you are comfortable around them. You're comfortable enough to acknowledge this thing about them. And that helps them feel like, oh my gosh, I don't have to explain myself to you. I don't have to explain myself to you, because you already know this thing about me that most people don't know, you know? If that makes sense. Just creates more opportunities for moments like that. And again, it is not only okay, but you should talk about disability with the same kind of attitude and the same kind of respect that you would talk about any other immutable aspect of someone's life, somebody's identity. Like, it's a part of who they are. So, I am so grateful and also kind of weirded out, but not that weirded out, because people who know me will watch this. I don't know. If you've watched this far, thank you. I often say I believe the world would be a better place if everyone would just listen to me, because I am very full of myself. Take that as you will. But thank you for listening. because this is something that's really important to me, and I hope that I have helped you understand why it's so important to me and why I think it should be important to you, probably, like, no matter who you are, especially if you live in the United States. So with that being said, for my description, I'm going to include the slides that I based this video on, the slides that I made the presentation with, and that is just like, that's your note cards. I made you note cards for free. Ah! They're not really note cards. They're word-heavy slides. But I'm going to separately, my sources are linked in the slides. And keep in mind, a lot of this is off the noggin. A lot of this is my way of understanding it. So, I don't know. Don't just make up your mind based on things that I say that are exclusively my thoughts. But do listen to me. If there's anything that I said out loud that did not visibly show a source, and if you go to a source, pretty much everything on the page that I link will be something that I referenced, if that makes sense. So, like, you would have to read the whole source to fully know every detail that exists in the source, which is bad sourcing on my part, but I will, again, have visual representations of all of my sources, and maybe I'll make a sound effect. Here's the sound effect. I'll edit that in. Every time a source pops up on the screen, and when I have that sound effect, I'll make it linkable, like a link that appears on the screen. So hopefully, if you have a visual impairment, that's accessible. If it's not accessible, then that'll be embarrassing for me. But once again, that's how my sources will be cited in the editing. Sources will be linked. Slides will be linked. The slides do not include everything I said, but they do include the skeleton of what I said. And pretty much if it's in the slides, then it's sourced. In any case, thank you for listening. I love you and appreciate you in a way that is far seriouser than you possibly are currently imagining. And goodbye. I'm sorry if you have a visual impairment. I'm making weird faces and gestures. And backing up slowly and falling and oh my god.